Hello, everybody. Now, Kevin, can you hear me as well?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, so Kevin and I are happy to be here with you today. Welcome to Eagle Point Funding's webinar. Today we're happy to host Kevin Young of KPY Young and Associates. Kevin is with us from Washington, D.C. So we'll discuss important topics of targeting, engaging, winning, and sustaining business with the U.S. federal market. I'm Anat Landa, sorry about that, Director of Business Development at Eagle Point Funding. And before we begin, I'll just start with a few words about us. To those of you who are joining us for the first time, Eagle Point Funding is a consulting firm specializing in the attainment of government grants and contracts for companies and research centers. Our main objective is to help our clients get as much funding as possible from government sources. We have extensive experience guiding companies that seek funding from nearly all non-dilutive sources out there. In the US, the main agencies are the DoD, NSF, and DHS. And in the EU, they're most notably Horizon 2020, Eureka, and Eurostars. Our fields of expertise are cybersecurity, big data, fintech, energy, aerospace, and ICT. To learn more about Eagle Point Funding, you can visit our website, eaglepointfunding.com. To keep up to date on the latest in R&D government funding, you can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as join our LinkedIn group. Our webinars are recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel called eaglepointfunding.com. In addition, I'll be sending out the slide deck to all of you who've registered for today's webinar, and feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some time for Q&A. You can enter your questions in the question window on the side of your screen. You're also welcome to contact us by sending an email. Our contact information, both mine and Kevin, is on the last slide of today's presentation. Now I'm happy to present Kevin Young, who is leading our webinar today. Kevin is a 30-year veteran of federal government contracting. He will provide an overview of his background once we begin. But today with Kevin, longtime industry expert is Karen C. Gauthier, who specializes in market knowledge, analysis, and identification and pipeline development. So thank you, Kevin, and thank you also, Karen. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. As Anat said, we're going to be doing a flyover on the federal government industry, a very fascinating industry. Next slide, please. We'll be talking a little bit about the objective. I'll give you a very brief overview of yours truly. Then we'll talk at the high level about this federal government for the United States. And then I'll give you some tips if you or your firms are interested in doing investments or looking for business in the federal industry. I'll save time for a few questions, but as Anat said, I'm more than happy to take something offline if you'd like to schedule a call. I apologize for the mistake with the graphic, but we will correct that when we send it out. Next slide, please. My objective here is to give you a flyover on how companies target, exchange, win, and sustain business in the U.S. federal government. Next slide, please. My background, very briefly, is 30-plus years in marketing and federal government. I've had the privilege of being a vice president or senior vice president for 3 Fortune 500 companies, including government contractors, Unisys and SAIC. I've been consulting for a number of years with federal contractors of all size and shape. And on nights and weekends, I serve as an adjunct professor of marketing for George Mason University, which is the largest university in Virginia, and I teach on the graduate, undergraduate, and executive education levels. Next slide, please. This is a little bit about my background and my qualifications. I do hold a government active secret clearance, which is important for those federal contractors who want to do secret or top secret or other type of classified work. Next slide, please. My contracting clients are on the left. You've probably heard of some of them. Boeing is one of the top 5 in the industry. Capgemini is a French company, and I'm working with them on their U.S. Business. Pitot Medical is a French company, and Northrop Grumman toward the bottom is again one of the top 5 with Boeing. Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. On the right are some of the agencies, departments, and offices I've worked with and have won business from. Next slide, please. All right, so let's get to the fun part. Let's talk about the U.S. federal government. Next slide, please. You may not know that there are more than 500,000 companies of all shapes, sizes, public, private, profit for non-profit, small and special size, set aside, which means they have special circumstances, being a veteran or disabled veteran or minority or woman-owned. There are more than 500,000 companies registered to do business with the government here in the United States, and in order to be registered, you have to be on the System for Award Management. Next slide, please. These 500,000 companies are chasing approximately $3.5 trillion in U.S. federal government spend every year, and that's on people, that's on programs, that's on products and services. The United States federal government is clearly the largest market in the world. If you would just take the Department of Interior, one of the departments that falls under the executive branch, in this case President Obama, if you took the Department of Interior at $18.5 billion a year, they would qualify as Fortune 80 or 82. And that's just one department of the U.S. federal government. And by the way, Department of Interior actually runs on a profit because they sell land and they sell drilling and fracking rates and things like that. Next slide, please. So these 500,000 companies chasing $3.5 trillion in business, most of them don't make any money whatsoever because the government contracting world is complex, it's cyclical, not every month and not every quarter is a buying month or buying quarter, and it's extremely competitive, as you can imagine. Next slide. And this is really just the 3 facts in a row. This just gives you a snapshot of how much money the U.S. government just spends on IT, just information technology, and it's clearly in the multi-billion dollars. Next slide, please. And these are some of the agencies that spend the money. These are not Department of Defense agencies, these are civilian agencies. So HHS is Health and Human Services, followed by the Department of Homeland Security, the Veterans Affairs, Treasury, and so forth. A lot of money being spent, and again, this is just an illustration on IT expenditures. Next slide, please. There are a whole bunch of minefields to do business with the government. They include knowing the fundamentals of contracting, understanding procurement cycles and procurement vehicles and channels, understand that many contracts slip to the right, and when they are awarded, they're protested. Next slide, please. And that talks to the contract award protest. I'll give you one example. There was a huge multi-billion-dollar vehicle that was awarded some years ago called CIO SP3, and there were 19 teams that went after it. 19. Every one of the primes had a big number of teammates, so it was probably more than 200 total companies went after this big procurement. The government awarded it to 10 of the 19 to compete for task orders. Well, the 9 that didn't win obviously protested, and when it was all said and done, all 19 teams were allowed to compete for task orders. We call that a bit of a goat rodeo on this side of the Atlantic. Next slide, please. Other minefields is you got to have laser clarity on timekeeping and on labor and on security clearances, and that's not only for individuals, but that's for facilities, and also you have to meet ethical, legal, or regulatory compliances. The government will come after folks who are breaking the law and are unethical or illegal. They'll sometimes put you on probation to do business with the government. Sometimes they even mandate that some of the key executives resign. That happened in the case of GTSI a few years ago in order to stay in business. And sometimes they'll just shut you down completely, but that is a rarity, but they will impose penalties. Next slide, please. So here are the 9 kind of fun areas, the minefields that companies who are selling to the government need to navigate. Next slide, please. Mark Amtower is a good friend of mine. He's really the godfather of government marketing, if you would. He writes books, he lectures, he has a radio show, which I've been on, Federal News Radio. But Mark's latest book really says, net, it's very difficult and it's very complex to do and to win business with the government. And Mark goes on to say that the government market is only sexy if you really like money. Next slide, please. American Express, in the last 7 years, has done similar surveys with their small business companies that sell to the government. And basically, American Express asked these small businesses 2 questions. 1, how long did it take to win your first piece of government work? And 2, how much did it cost in terms of outlays before you saw your first penny of recognized revenue? And when American Express did this survey about 5-6 years ago, the answers were about 20 months to win the first deal and about $85,000 in outlays before the company saw its first nickel. In subsequent survey, the 20 months remains the same in terms of first deal, but now the investments have gone up to about $115,000. So net is you got to be a little bit patient. You have to understand that you probably won't be revenue neutral to maybe your 6th or your 7th quarter, and then hopefully you'll start making some money and have a good annuity business with the government. Next slide, please. And also, and for those who are in Israel as well as those who might be in other parts of the world, you know what's going on with our election. This is no stranger. We have almost daily congressional infighting between the different parties, not uncommon in other countries, but also subsets within those parties. We have what's called continuing budget resolution, which is just kicking the can down the road. They agree on a number for a budget, but they really don't get into the weeds on where the allocation should be. And that's why when we had our first sequestration in 2013, people were a little bit in flux because the sequestration, which came after 5 months or 5 months into the budget, said you got to cut 10% across the board. Well, 10% over 7 months is really like 18% over 12 months, so that's something else the government has to deal with. We have 4 shutdowns. We were shut down most recently in 2013 for 17 days. And why that's important is a lot of federal contractors have staffing services, and they bill for when people are at the government buildings doing work for the government. When the government has a forced shutdown, no one gets paid. And then, of course, you have your national election freeze. awards and announcements are kind of held up, usually during a national election. If the parties change, if a Democrat administration becomes Republican or vice versa, the new in-power administration will normally ask for a freeze on all recent awards and all to-be-determined awards, just so they can review them. That freezes the market, and to some extent the midterm elections do too. That's every 2 years. Next slide, please. And I don't know if you remember Lyndon Johnson, the Texas senator who became president when John Kennedy was killed. He was John Kennedy's vice president, but after finishing Kennedy's term and then winning a term himself, his quote basically sums it all up for working in Washington. He said, if one morning I walked across the top of the water across the Potomac, the headline that afternoon in the Washington Post would read, "President can't swim." So a very interesting industry and a very interesting city. And by the way, if you look at the top 10 wealthiest counties in the United States, and there's about 3,300 counties, 6 of the top 10 are around Washington, D.C. because of all the business. Next slide, please. So how do you survive and how do you thrive in the federal government? It's possible, and I'm going to give you some very high-level tips, and I'm happy to, as I mentioned, carve out some time to do deeper dives. Next slide, please. We'll fix the format on this when we send this out. But if you go to the first column and out, if you can backtrack a couple, please. Thank you. What you really have to do is know what you don't know. And I call that a gap analysis. You have to figure out if your company, which obviously sells to other businesses, so it's a B2B, and or it sells to consumers, a B2C, you have to figure out if you're going to the government, B2G, what do you have to do different? And there's a list of things you really need to look at for doing different, from really understanding the market to understanding the dynamics, to having the infrastructure to go into federal business, and of course your standard brand image and promotion and thought leadership, and clearly business development vehicles and channels. So the first thing you have to do, and the first thing I do with new clients new to the government, is do a gap analysis. Next slide, please. You have to figure out how you're going to go to market. The classic SWOT analysis, what are your strengths? Obviously those would be your value propositions. What are your weaknesses? Obviously you want to convert those to opportunities. And then what are the threats? And in the federal government, I outlined the threats a couple minutes ago, from sequestration to government shutdown to budget resolution issues. You have to understand who your competitors are, how you position against them, and the standard blocking and tackling for your brand, image, your thought leadership, business development, and goals and metrics. So once you identify the gaps, you need to remediate them through go-to-market planning, execution, management, and measurement. Next slide, please, Anat. So how do you get business? Well, you leverage your certifications and your reps, and that could be everything from small business, again, disabled business, hub zone, which is poor area. The government allots about 23 to 26 cents on the dollar to these set-aside companies, veteran, disabled veteran, minority-owned, Alaskan-owned, and the like. There's a myriad of certifications and classifications. You have to figure out what makes a good opportunity. I'll share that with you in a few minutes. A screening document. You have to make sure that you have a robust pipeline, because again, the government is a cyclical business, and some months and quarters are stronger than others, and you have to make sure that you have good pipelines so you can keep the lights on, as well as the heat or air conditioning. And you have to figure out how you're going to sell to the government. Companies have 3 to 4 ways to sell to the government. One is direct. One is through schedules that the General Service Administration has put together, one, say, for technology or for logistics or for printing or whatever it is. or you can go through prime contractors who are going to be the majority on the deal, and you will come with past performance or two, and you'll come with good pricing and a good story to tell, and you would be a partner. The final way companies sell, if they're selling products to the government, most would be through affiliated agents, and that would be someone like a Carahsoft Technology or an Immix Group that would allow you to piggyback off them, use their procurement vehicles and channels, and give them 8, 10, or 12 points on the deal. And the good news is you don't need a sales rep, so the 8, 10, or 12 points that probably would have gone for commission is going to go to the person of the company that allows you to be affiliate agent. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Anat.
Yes, just a second.
So this is just, 26 is just a combination of what I just said. So the first thing you have to do is figure out, once you do your gap analysis, where you have blind spots in terms of compliance. And again, I went over these, but these are 9 areas that you really have to think about in terms of compliance. One of my clients does logistics in Detroit. They're in Dearborn. They do a lot of parts and shipping and toolkits for Ford and for Chrysler and for General Motors. And recently they won a deal to support the United States Air Force on their new F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and the prime on that's Lockheed Martin. Well, my client out of Detroit had to really make sure that the security clearances were all in place, because the parts that we're keeping for this joint fighter obviously were classified, and so not only were the people under security clearances, but so was the facility, as well as the trucks and all the other products and processes they use to support the F-35. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about go-to-market. Once you have your infrastructure ready to roll, what do you have to do for go-to-market? Anat, if you can go back one. The first thing is basically your toolkit. Every company, regardless of who you're selling to, has the basic blocking and tackling here. You have your business cards, you have your promotion, you probably have a credentials brochure, a PowerPoint, you have proposal boilerplate that you use. You have websites for the government. Maybe you have your own microsite. Maybe have mobile apps. And in all of these, you have to make sure that your mission, your vision, and your value proposition is clearly indicated. Next slide, please. So once you have your toolkit done, you got to kind of figure out where you're going to meet prospects and where you're going to meet hopefully new clients. And they could be the prime contractors you want to meet. They may be some good subs you want to meet. Clearly the program management office of the government, the contract office of the government, the OSTABU office, that's a small business office for the government. How do you meet them? Well, here's kind of an example for a company that would be in the defense business. You have some really good conferences, from aerospace and cyber to AFCEA, to the Army, which has been around a long time, to the drones, the unmanned vehicle systems, which is getting, as you can imagine, very popular. There's, last time I looked, almost 300 vendors exhibiting in the drone conference or the unmanned conference. And of course, Navy League's been around for a long time too. So those are some of the key associations. Next slide, please. And then obviously you want to leverage the media. In Washington, it's a whole game. It's a whole different game. 1105 Media dominates really the magazine business and the blog business. Federal News Radio is a sister station of our all-news station, WTOP. Federal News Radio is what it is. It's all news for federal employees and contractors. And that's the one I've been on a few times on Mark Amtower's show. And their Bonneville station. And then there's some also pretty big publications, including Washington Business Journal and the Washington Post has a weekly publication on capital business. So those are some of the key players for the media part of your go-to-market. Next slide, please. And there you go, kind of a menu right there. Let's talk a little bit of pipeline development. As I mentioned, there's 4 paths for selling to the government. This is just kind of a hypothetical. If you want to sell to the Department of Defense, which is clearly based, most of the decisions out of the Pentagon, right near Washington, D.C. They say they're, okay, so they're technically in Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, and below are some of the the different organizations. You've got everything from the Pentagon, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. One sidebar, the Coast Guard is part of our armed services, part of our Department of Defense, if you would, but because of the new Department of Homeland Security that came to being about 15 years ago after 9/11, Coast Guard is now Homeland Security, but they're obviously part of defense because they defend our borders and our Great Lakes and all. Next slide, please. When you do pipeline development and when you start building a business development process, you clearly have to have these things. I mean, you have to have market knowledge, you have to have competitive information, you have to have a pretty good lead screening process, what is and what is not a good deal. You have to have a balanced pipeline development, and again, we'll correct this slide. The government people don't really talk in terms of revenue and margin for deals. They talk in terms of total contract values for deals. And then there's equations where you multiple the potential revenue on a deal for you by your percentage of winning it, and then you come up with formal TCVs. You also have to have a good process for capture, and I'll show you a slide in a couple minutes on that. You have to have a good process for proposal response, because these proposals are a little bit different than commercial proposals. If the government asks you to give them A, B, and C on their compliance matrix, and you give them A, B, and D, they're going to disqualify you because the government wants you to answer the mail. If they ask for apples, don't give them oranges. And the government is looking to be honest with all the competitors to thin the herd, if you would. So if companies don't answer the mail or make a mistake, they'll be disqualified. If they ask you for 5 past performances to show that you've done it before, the work, and it could be in the commercial's allowed for past performances, but if they ask you for 5 and they decide that one of them is a little bit squirrely, maybe it's from a company you bought or whatever, they'll disqualify you, and since you don't have 5 past performances anymore, you can't proceed on the procurement. And then, of course, you want to know where you made mistakes and improve it. Next slide. This is, I give this to my clients for free. It's taken probably 20 years for me to confirm all of this, but knowing the right sources, whether they're primary or secondary research, and being able to integrate the material and come up with some ideas, some analysis on where the opportunities are. And you can get them by talking to folks at the program office for the government, as well as a contract office, as well as industry experts and influencers. You can certainly look at the strategic plans and directions of the government agency. You can confirm at the OMB level, is there a budget assigned to this program? You can also look at some other areas such as the GSA's Federal Procurement Data System. You can go ahead and buy licensed market knowledge. Deltek, Bloomberg Government, and Govini, which is listed on the bottom, are 3, probably the top 3 companies that sell competitive knowledge to federal contractors, including opportunities. And you could also get opportunities for free on the Federal Business Opportunity website, FBO, but the licensed subscribers do a little bit more work on it and obviously confirm it and also package some consulting with it. So not one place to know where your leads are. It's really a hybrid, but it's a good place. These are good places to start doing your digging. Next slide, please. I'm going to apologize because I'm sure you really can't read this. I will say it's a very exciting slide. This is a real-life example of a lead screen. All the way on the left is you have suspects, which is kind of a parking lot of opportunities that you have brought to the federal contractor, or the federal contractor has found. And there's a lot of ways to get to this parking lot, and I'm happy to talk one-on-one. A lot of good research techniques. But a suspect is a suspect, and then you decide whether it goes forward or gets canned. A lead basically says that money's been requested by the government, and you're building a relationship, and the government has a need where you have a solution, and the deal is not wired. A lead becomes a prospect when the government does get the money for the program. In other words, the program is funded. You now have a relationship with the key influencers, which would be the program office and the contract office. You do have a solution for a problem the government has. The deal is not wired, and it's going to happen within X amount of months. A prospect becomes a proposal when the government sends you anything from sources sought, which is really just a 2 or 3 pager saying, hey, are you interested in bidding on this? They're just trying to get a bid. They're just trying to get a list of federal contractors out there who might be interested. And then you have everything from an RFI, request for information, to a draft RFP. A draft RFP does not have all the guts in it, but it has a general flyover of what the government's looking for. And usually a draft RFP allows you a couple of weeks to ask government questions or say, this doesn't make sense. And then the government say, you're right, we'll fix this. And then, of course, you have your formal RFP. And then once the proposal is submitted, then that's yet another phase, and you figure out whether you're going to win or lose, or it's going to be deferred. If you win or lose, is there a protest? So each of these lanes, these swim lanes, lead, suspect, proposal, underway, proposal, responded, will have a total contract value assigned to them. So if you keep that consistent, let's say $50 million in total contract value, then you should be able, again, to keep the lights on, because where there's drop-offs, you'll have backfill. So the suspects are always a parking lot, and they either go right or they go away, and then you run your business development from there. Next slide, please. This is an example of a business development pipeline. All this really says is if you need one of something in a contract award, and you know that you need 10 to go into the pipeline for one to come out as a win, and you have 10 reps, or you have 100 reps, or you have 10 different products or services, or 5 different regions of the country. This is just basically saying, these are the types of numbers you need to feed into the pipeline in order to make your numbers for the year. Next slide, please. This is a very formal capture process. This is used by most federal contractors. For the bigger deals, I'm not saying you have to go through this comprehensive methodology for every deal. If you're ready on a schedule, or if you're ready on a procurement vehicle, and you just may get a task order from it because you're already pre-qualified, you don't have to go through all this. The task order could just be pricing or a couple of other questions. But this is a formal process, and it could take anywhere from 2 or 3 months to, I've seen it take over a year. But this is what companies go through, federal contractors, including reviews and price to wins and everything in order to have the best shot at a deal. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm not telling you anything that you probably don't know, being investors or being in leadership roles with your company. Next slide. There's only 6 ways that a company can grow. You could take your same products and services and go to your same industries and markets and hope for nirvana. Or you could take those same products and services and look at ancillary adjacent markets and industries. The third way companies grow is adding products and or services in their current markets, or adding products and services in new ancillary adjacent markets. The fifth way companies grow is through partnerships and alliances. Here in the U.S., probably one of the best examples of that, where neither side got killed, was when FedEx and Kinko's merged about 21 years ago. That was on a B2B and B2C side, but that it was successful for both sides. And what most federal contractors do, especially the mid and the large ones, is if they need a particular technology or capability or they want to get into a customer set, they'll write a check. Accenture, I'm sure you know Accenture, the big consulting firm, they have a federal arm. They wanted to get in agile computing and get Scrum Masters and everything else. They didn't want to build it themselves. They didn't want to partner with it, so they bought it. Accenture wrote a big check and they bought Agilex, which is a mid-sized federal contractor in agile computing. Next slide. So this is where I ask if there's any questions or comments, and then as Anat referred or mentioned, my contact information follows. So Anat, can we open it up for questions?
Sure. So here is the contact information. Is there anything else you wanted to add here?
No, this is just some propaganda about my background and my expertise. But again, I'm open for any questions on how to look at strategy for the federal government and look at marketing and business development and business management.
Right. So here is a slide to show you all how to type in the question. And thank you very much, Kevin, for this very interesting and informative webinar. So I do have, I do have some questions I see here. So the first question is, what should companies worry about in moving from an established business-to-business, B2B, approach to a new business-to-government, B2G approach?
Well, you know, as I mentioned, businesses grow, as we just showed on the growth slide, a number of ways, and one of them is to take their products and services and go to a different industry. So what I've been talking about, obviously, is going from a business to business or business to commercial to business to government. What you really have to worry about, again, is making sure that you cross all your T's and dot all your I's, making sure that you know what you don't know in terms of government regulations, knowing about the government procurement cycles, knowing that you need to be patient because, again, as American Express has shown us through their clients, it will take up to 5 or 6, probably closer to 7 quarters before you're revenue neutral in the federal space. And I know the CFO will probably be turning red and everything else, but you need flexibility and you need confidence. And so for a federal government, you may want to treat it you know, for the first year or two as an incubator or as an opportunistic industry. Obviously, you're going to be in the negative the first year because you have investments. By late in the second year, you should be starting to show revenue recognition. So patience, 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 but the money is out there. $3.5 trillion is spent by the government every year. Now, the bad news is they only bring in $2.2 trillion. So the U.S. federal government borrows the rest from companies such as China, Japan, and Brazil, but the money is there. They will spend it. And another thing is if a government department or agency doesn't spend the money by September 30th, which is the end of their year, if they don't spend the money, by putting out a contract or by buying something within that year, they will lose that money. So that's why when most summers are quiet around the country, August and September are laser busy for government contractors, because the government is pushing contracts off their desks before they expire, the funding expires. And the bad news for a government program office is if you don't use your money in the year they gave you the money by September 30th, and then you go back in October and say, hey, can I have the money again? Yeah, that's very difficult. You didn't use it last year after you made a case for it. So long story short is, as I mentioned, it's a cyclical industry, and you're going to have very busy summers. But be flexible and be patient.
Okay, so I guess patience is really the best summary.
Yeah, you need to tell, if you're not the CEO or the CFO, the COO, you need to tell them, look, this is an opportunistic market for us. It's very broad and very deep, but it takes a little while to get going. And we need to invest in it. We need to treat it as an incubator, and and then from year 3 on, you should be rocking and rolling, and start showing some good business, especially annuity business.
Right. So from our approach, we see exactly the same thing. So I can totally agree with your point. I do have another question here. Can small companies actually survive doing business with the U.S. federal government?
Oh, yes, they can, because the government, as I mentioned, not only targets 23 to 26 cents of all dollars, they request that primes allocate that for the set-asides and the small businesses. But there are contracts that are exclusive only to small businesses. And small businesses just compete with other small businesses. So if you have a good product or service to sell, and you have some good efficient rates, and you're in compliance, and you have some good technical solutions or product solutions, by all means you can survive and you can grow. And there's also something called the SBA program, the Small Business Administration Program, 8A, number 8A, in which the government will help small businesses market themselves to kind of get a head start. So absolutely small businesses can survive if you do the right thing. Otherwise you're going to be steamrolled over, unfortunately.
Right. So here is another question I see. How does a small company promote itself to federal government with a limited marketing budget?
Well, that's a really good question. The answer probably is more along the line of thought leadership than branding. Perhaps contribute to a white paper that talks about a problem. Perhaps get on a speaking panel where the government is there, breakout speaking panel as an expert in your field. Perhaps offer an educational webinar for the government to take on a particular technology. There's many ways to leverage a small company through thought leadership. I will say, though, don't forget about the toolkit that I mentioned. You're still going to want to have a website that the government can go to. It's got to be a website that looks, smells, and tastes like a federal government website. It could be a microsite off your regular website. It should be something like /federal or /government or /public sector. But it will have what the government's looking for. It will have your NAITS code, your DUN code, your CAGE code. It will have a list of past performances where you've done work before. And again, when you're a new company, those past performances can certainly be commercial as long as they were done within the last couple of years. You would want to have information for contacts, not only for the government, but also for for potential partners. So website is, so anyway, long story short, you can cost effectively brand yourself through thought leadership, speaking, writing, again, and make sure that you have a web page, because you're going to have a call to action for them to visit you, and you want to have something that looks professional. The last thing I wanted to mention is, and this may be a little bit confusing, but the federal government sometimes puts out questions of problems they're having. NASA does it twice a year. The DoD does it 3 times a year. They do it through SBIRs, and SB stands for small business. And what the government will do is they'll put out questions. And a real live question was for the International Space Station, whenever we sent supply ships up there, they had problems docking. I mean, really, really docking. And they said, how do we fix this? And industry came up with a laser system that actually will enable cargo ships and supply ships that are going up to the International Space Station, about 230 miles in space, to dock. And that came out of SBIR. SBIRs are reserved for small business, mostly technical companies. STTRs are with those businesses working with the universities, such as Virginia Tech here. So you can definitely get the government's attention through helping them solve a problem that they'll throw out as an SBIR and STTR. Usually if you win the first round, you know, when you kind of get their attention, and they'll usually award about $100,000 for a principal investigator from the company to put together more details on how you would solve the problem. If the government then likes how you're going to solve the problem, and again, there'll be a couple of companies that the government will ask to solve this problem. If they like what you're doing, then phase 1 becomes phase 2, and you start working toward a proof of concept. And you can get up to about $250,000 for the government developing a proof of concept to solve their problem. And obviously, if they like your proof of concept and they like how you're going to solve the problem, that could very well become a program that you have now won and you are now running for the federal government. And it could be just a couple of guys in a basement, you know, but if you're registered on SAM, and if you're deep, inch wide, mile deep, and what you know and what the government needs, and you can certainly make a living off that.
Right. These examples you're sharing with us are really fascinating, and just comes to show how simple it can be, but challenging, of course.
Well, I'll give you one other one, and I'm probably going to lose some support here, but the snipers that we use in the battlefield, their ammo after so many yards is impacted and affected by rain and wind and yada yada. So for the snipers to be able to have longer shots, if you would, one of the SBIRs actually asked, you know, can you adjust the scope and all based on lasers, and taking into account if it's raining and what the temperature is and what the winds are doing. So that too, you know, it's not a pleasant program, but it's a necessary program. That too came out of a research question.
Very interesting. I do have one more question here. What are the common traits of successful federal government contractors?
They are constantly aware of what's going on in the industry. So market knowledge and competitive knowledge is a very important trait. Those that are smaller and successful are, as I mentioned, an inch wide and a mile deep. They're not a mile wide and an inch deep. They're not everything to everyone. They know what they're good at. They have past performances. They have pricing. They have good relationships on the contractor side for partnerships and on the government side. And they have a balanced pipeline. So they're constantly feeding the pipeline to make sure that, you know, again, they can make their numbers. Those are all the traits of a successful federal contractor. You know, they don't run circles. They don't go after anything with that has a dollar sign associated. They know what they're good at, and that's what they go after. And if they have a weak spot, a blind spot in what the government's asking for, then a good federal contractor will go find a partner. Or if you have enough money, you go buy someone.
Right. Okay, so the last question here I see is more up to date to the recent events and to what we're looking forward to next week, the elections. So how does the U.S. national presidential election impact the federal contractors' businesses?
Well, when Bill Clinton took over, when he beat George W. Bush in, I think it was the year 2000, so that was a Republican administration leaving, a Democrat administration coming in. He asked for the resignation of all the secretaries of the Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, all the contracts, as I mentioned. So in that case, there was a freeze. I was with IBM. We had enough money and coverage to survive the freeze, but it was a couple-month freeze. Typically, when a Republican is in office, the $3.5 trillion, and it's always going to be about $3.5 trillion to spend, is usually more focused on defense and security and making the defense contractors happy. When a Democrat is in office, you might have more focus on environment, alternative energy, critical infrastructure, health, IT. So it's really just the different philosophies of the Democrats and the Republicans on how to spend the money. Mm-hmm. So if Donald Trump somehow, some way becomes president, he's probably going to have a different approach to how to slice the pie than Hillary Clinton, who has already said that she's going to follow a lot of Obama's, plans, programs. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's usually the biggest thing, and between a Republican and its focus areas and it's a freeze if administrations change, from a Republican to a Democrat or vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure to have you, Kevin, in our webinar, and we look forward to being in touch with you. Again, if you have any further questions to Kevin, you can send him an email. Here is again his contact information, and if you want to be in touch with me regarding Eagle Point funding, you can also send me an email. And once again, I'll be sending out the slides and the recording of this webinar to all of you who registered. And thanks again for attending. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinars.